Hello, and welcome to the Stat Nerd Draft Report. Today we have a few guests that I really enjoy talking to who are all really comfortable using stats in their analysis. First up is Jacob Goldstein, a writer for Nylon Calculus and Real Ball Insider. Next up is a must-follow for stat nerds like me, and hopefully you, Advancedstats23. And finally, the last guest today was one of my partners for the recently released 94 Feet Report Draft Guide, and a writer at Fear the Sword, Eustacchio Raulli. Thanks for joining me, guys. How many players deep do you have tier 1? Advanced stats, let's go with you first.
I just have it one player deep. I think Luka Doncic is clearly ahead of everyone in this class just from his safety perspective. He's a player dominating or close to dominating. He's a player dominating or close to dominating the second best pro league in the world. And it's just hard to see how he fails. And his upside is he's a very unique prospect because if you just look at his athleticism, his upside isn't that high, but he's got such a well-rounded game that it's easy to see how he can get to second best player on the title team.
Yeah, I actually think his athleticism may even be a little bit underrated, but I do think it does cap his ceiling a tad bit. I see where you're coming from with that. Jacob, what do you think?
I would agree. This is the second year in a row he's been a top 5 player statistically, and as Advanced Stats said, the second best league in the world, which I think is something that gets intensely underrated come draft time. As we would so much easier to see all these NCAA prospects. This league in the world is actually in Europe, and so a guy who's 19 is able to be the best player in that league is incredible. And yes, there are concerns about his athleticism, but he's not unathletic. He's a good enough athlete that I think with all of his skill and his incredibly elite basketball IQ, there's just so few situations where he fails.
Yeah, I think the safety of Doncic is really appealing, along with the upside and kind of just all the things he brings to the table. Eustachio, what do you think about your tier 1? How many players deep is it?
I'll throw a couple other names into the ring. I also have Jaren Jackson Jr. in that tier, and as well as DeAndre Ayton. I think both of them are very safe picks to become productive players and have very high upside as well. Jaren mostly on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from with the Jaren Jackson especially. I'm kind of even considering moving him up above Doncic on my board. Not that that's a slight on Doncic in the slightest, but I just see so many things that Jaren Jackson does at such a young age that you just kind of see that if everything works out for him, his ceiling is just absurd. And Ayton's the same way in that if everything works out, that the ceiling is really, really high. But I think the chances that the ceiling works out, is a lot less than Jaren Jackson. So, him getting to his, 85th percentile isn't as good as Jaren Jackson maybe, but him getting to his 95th percentile may be better than Jaren Jackson. So, staying on Ayton, I think he's probably the most polarizing player, at least in this range in the draft. What are some potential red flags when looking at his defense?
Defender.
Centers that have been bad at defense in college becoming positive impact players on that end of the court in the NBA. Eustachio, let's go ahead and start with you since we had an article with him earlier.
Yeah, there's certainly plenty of red flags here. He wasn't very good defensively out on the perimeter this year. A lot of it had to do with their scheme because they showed hard on the pick and roll, and then Ayton was expected to recover to his defender who his teammates often didn't tag, so was wide open a lot of the time. But he also didn't make the right read a lot of times in the pick and roll, and he just didn't show the instincts that you would expect out of a rim protector at the next level. He has great tools. He's a fantastic defensive rebounder, but there's definite issues on this side of the ball. The history of centers that were bad at defense in college but there's definite issues on this side of the ball. The history of centers that were bad at defense in college becoming positive. The best example I could come up with and he was only good for a very brief time. But Larry Sanders had fantastic physical tools in college, wasn't a good defender at that time, but he became one of the best defenders in the league, actually, for like a season and a half, and then he was gone. But so I don't know if Ayton can follow that path, but I do think there is some precedent for guys with great tools stepping that up at the next level.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about the Larry Sanders one, but that's an interesting one. Obviously, we hope that he doesn't end up the same way Sanders did in terms of career, but that would be a potential like positive outcome, I think, that would really work out on the defensive end. Obviously, offensively, you want more out of him than Sanders, but
Those guys on Ayton, like the defensive red flags really worry me. It's not just his block percentage or anything. His steal percentage was really absurdly low, as I think Dean pointed out. And just watching him, I watched a lot of his games. He just feels like he's in position to contest like a bunch of these shots, and he just decides not to jump. It's really odd.
yeah, I recall especially just one. He was on help side, and there was I think a side pick and roll going on the other side, and the roller was just wide open, and Aiden watched as he got a layup, and I was just like, wow, that just can't fly at the next level. Jacob, what do you think about Aiden and his defense in particular?
So I was looking through the like luck adjusted on-off numbers that I did for the season, and Arizona's defense was 4 points per 100 possessions better with him off. Incredibly athletic, large center. Like most even poor NBA defenders dominate college defensively. Like Karl Anthony Towns was a good defender in college, even though he's been sucky at it in the NBA. So for me, statistically, it's an incredibly large red flag that despite his physical prowess and all of his tools, he still is a negative, not just impact, like not making a big impact. He was a big negative on the court. And I haven't seen a big center touted as a franchise level guy with such defensive issues in at least as long as I've been really following the NBA and doing analysis for it closely.
Yeah, and I think it's the potential downside that makes me weary of slotting him in that tier one. You know, in the tier two, there's associated weaknesses with most of the players there, but in that tier one, you all safely have the high floor. But let's talk about things we like about Aiden and avenues he could have to becoming a top 10 player in the league. Jacob, what do you think about his chances at that?
I think as bad as he is defensively for a center, he is that good offensively for a center. Like his touch and feel around the basket are at times incredible. He projects statistically to be incredible on that end. Just like no matter what, it's incredibly rare to get a David Robinson-sized prospect who can jump as high as Robinson could and maybe has a little three-point range in him. It's just an incredible mash of skill sets and such like ridiculous tools around that it's hard. Which is one of the reasons he's such a polarizing prospect, because he is so tantalizing when you watch him, but at the same time, defensively there's all these issues. So I think the offense really stands out, especially for his size, for everything we've seen from other recent centers in college. He's just incredible on that end.
It's really just like, do you want to bite on the upside? Advanced stats, what do you think about that upside?
Well, I think the defense kind of caps the upside to a certain extent, but offensively, I really liked what he showed as a passer also. I think his passing has gotten a bit underrated. You could see him from standstill making these good reads and these accurate passes that gave Arizona some good shots. So along with the physical tools, his obvious really high-level touch, his passing, he can be a really, really good offensive player. I'm just not really sold on the defense. Touch, his passing, he can be a really, really good offensive player. I'm just not really sold on the defense.
Yeah, and I mean, your concerns are definitely justified. Eustacchio, bring some positivity to the Ayton party right now.
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Advanced Stats just mentioned with the passing, because um, that's usually a red flag for a lot of good college post players. They're good at scoring in the post, but once they get to the pros and they're facing good help defense consistently when they get the ball down low, they aren't able to create from their teammates down there. Ayton might be the rare prospect that you can run a team offense through from the post. He against hard doubles and pass out situations, 75 passes for 110 points. That's 1.467 points per possession on his pass outs. That's an incredible number. It means that gravity down there, that he's just throwing the ball to wide open players. And when you watch him, I mean, the passing angles and the velocity he's able to get on the ball, it just really stands out that these are passes that very few players can make, not just now, but even in history. And so if he's able to develop into that offensive hub in the post, it's an uphill battle in today's game. That has to be admitted. But if he can develop into that player that you can run an offense through from the low post, I think it's maybe even probable that he becomes a top 10 player.
Okay. I'm not even going to say it's a hot take. Probable becomes a top 10 player because, I mean, I think that's a pretty normal take going with just the standard scouting right now. I think the ceiling definitely, like, it's undoubtable the ceiling's there because you get him in the right system, and if the defense does, I mean, you just have to obviously see, like, he's going to be a problem for a lot of teams. So let's move on to my personal favorite big in this class. I'll try to state my biases ahead of time, obviously. Jaren Jackson Jr. He has some flags, but do you think they're more red flags or yellow? Advanced Stats, what do you think?
I think the one unique thing about him is he doesn't really have a glaring weakness like Ayton does. And that's also why I have him as the number one big in this class. He needs to get a bit stronger, I think, but he's really good on the glass. The only thing is he tries to block everything, and that's kind of like a yellow flag for me. I'd like to see him be a little bit more selective, but it's possible just Izzo with their big man depth wanted him to play that way, and it'll be a little bit more smart in the NBA.
Yeah, I think that
Depth wanted him to play that way, and it'll be a little bit more smart in the NBA.
Yeah, I think the high foul rate can definitely be a problem in some situations. But when you watch the film for him, it's not like he's in the wrong position and he's getting fouls. He's there and he's just being too aggressive, which is something you can more easily dial back. Jacob, what do you think about Jaren Jackson Jr. and his potential red or yellow flags?
I love Jaren Jackson. I think he's a really fun prospect to watch. I think he always puts on a really nice show. The one kind of yellowish flag I have is his on-off numbers aren't great. They're more in the realm of he makes a small impact on his team in that regard, but nothing major. And that's slightly more of a concern for me than most prospects who you can see that with, because the on and off samples are both pretty equal. They're both about 1,000 possessions. So it's a little worrisome. That was my favorite big in the class. I mean, I could, if he falls more than past 3, I think some team's going to get an incredible steal.
Oh, yeah, past 3. I'm going to be going crazy if he's there at 4. That would, oh, man. But to shoot it back to you real quick, Jacob, do you think maybe the quality of his teammates has something to do with that on-off? Like Miles Bridges and Nick Ward, obviously, are both two, I think, pretty good players. And Cassius Winston, solid point guard. I'm higher on him, I think, than most, honestly.
Yeah, that certainly plays into it a bit. Like no one on that Michigan State team really has eye-popping on-off numbers in general. But even compared to some of his other teammates, they're still a bit smaller. Of course, once you start like incorporating box score and stuff, it rises to just ludicrous levels. So that's why I'm not gonna be calling it a major problem or anything. But it's a little who's so well regarded for the way that he can impact the game, seeing more moderately based impacts on off numbers.
Yeah, I get that. We'll keep an eye on that, see if his rookie season I mean, obviously, rookie season on-off numbers are not going to be good usually anyways, but depending on the situation, it could be that we can get some indication early. Eustacchio, bring us home on Jaren Jackson.
I think, if anything, I wouldn't call it a red flag, but it might be orangish. Just he kind of faded into the background sometimes on offense. And overall, because he played so few minutes, his offensive sample is not that big. It's hard to feel confident about his game on that end. On the one hand, because the sample's so small, he could grow tremendously as a player. He has a lot of upside. He's one of the youngest prospects in the class, but it's also possible that he becomes just like a fourth option, 16% usage player at the next level. I still think he can add value as a player like that because of his defense, but I think it is something that concerns me a little bit.
That's totally a fair concern. I think his assertiveness offensively is something that needs to increase if he's going to justify where I have him on my board. But it's something I think that will increase. Like, he was extremely young this year. He's going to be under 19 at the time of the draft. And I think that it's, like you said, it's a yellow flag and not a red flag, as I think some people seem to make it. Talking about his upside, though, what's the near ceiling you can see for him, Eustacchio?
The name that comes to mind for me is Serge Ibaka. I think Ibaka, if you were to put his offensive peak and his defensive peak at the same time, he kind of peaked on the two different sides of the ball a few years apart. But if you paired that together, you get a player that's about +1 on offense and +4, 4.5 on defense. And I think that's about where Jaren's ceiling is. I could definitely see him becoming that type of player.
Okay, and Jacob, what about you for his ceiling?
I would actually agree with that pretty dead on. I think if he's able to time it right, he could be a really good ancillary piece on a championship team. I don't think he's really built to be like typical star in that sense. Like, I don't think he's going to be carrying any scoring load really, but he's absolutely the kind of guy that if you pair him off well with a good scorer, he can really carry that team to the next level with his just great defensive instincts, as long as he is able to rein in
just jumping too much. So we'll see if that's another similarity that's there. Advanced stats, what do you think about his ceiling? You a little bit higher on his possible ceiling?
Yeah, I'm a little bit higher. I think he's got a little bit more creation upside than Ibaka has shown. You can see at times near the end of the year, he has a bit of a handle, and he showed better ability to attack closeouts. Of course, he had a brutal Big Ten tournament, but other than that, I think he showed the ability to where you can see him attack closeouts, which is pretty rare for bigs, especially. I don't know. I think he can be a 15, 16-point scorer. I've seen some even go as high as Chris Bosh. I definitely don't see that kind of shot creation, but I think he's got a little bit more usage in him than Ibaka does.
And see, I've gone to the Chris Bosh comparison, but not the Toronto Chris Bosh, the Miami Chris Bosh. He's going to be a better switch. And see, I've gone to the Chris Bosh comparison, but not the Toronto Chris Bosh, the Miami Chris Bosh. He's going to be a better rim protector, I think, than that. But he definitely has the lateral quickness to hedge if he needed to, given the scheme, or switch if he needs to. I think he could do either. And I mean, shooting threes a game at his minutes, hitting I think just under 40%. Like, it's hard not to, for me at least, to not be confident in his at least ability to stretch the floor and create gravity, which I think has a lot of offensive value in and of itself. Switching on to, I think, is probably the main attraction, in my opinion, on this podcast, Luka Doncic. So can you explain how Doncic was able to reportedly break Morey's draft model with how well he was playing? And are you concerned with his three-point shooting? Advanced stats, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean,
Advanced stats, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I've seen some advanced stats that suggest he's been the best player in the league. And at his age, that's so unprecedented. I'm not sure if Ricky Rubio even was this high, and he he broke some draft models pretty bad too. And so his aggressiveness has gone up from last year, and he's being asked more to shot create, and he's doing it so efficiently. I'm not really worried about the three-point shooting. His free throw percentage has consistently been high, and I think he's going to be a good shooter. I think his shot selection at times, he falls in love with the pull-up J a little bit too much, but I'm not really worried about that. I think he's definitely going to be a good shooter.
And Eustacchio, how do you feel about his three-point shooting? And if you want to attack the draft model question, go ahead on that as well.
The three-point shooting, I mean, it concerns me a little bit as far as what his ceiling, close to 40% from three. But at the same time, I don't think like he's going to be a bad three-point shooter. I would expect at least 35, 36% and probably higher. And it's just the shot quality he's taking right now. It's been because he's taken a lot of bad shots. At the next level, he's going to have more shot creation around him. Pretty much every guard and wing in the NBA has the ability to put the ball on the floor and at least collapse the defense and kick it out, and often more advanced skills than that. So he's going to have a lot more spot-up opportunities, perhaps the chance to work off screens more. And so I think that'll help out his three-point percentage long-term.
I think that I agree with you on his three-point shooting. If you get him in a smaller role and he's just spotting up, he's definitely going to be, I think, at least an average three-point shooter. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but the way I look.
Yeah, I'm not worried at all either. Like in my model, he still projects to wind up as a 36, 37 or so % shooter, despite coming way down this year with all the pull-up, really tough threes he's been taking. I guess I'll quickly tackle the draft model question, because at the time Maury mentioned that, I think on whose pod was it? Bill Simmons, someone like that. When he mentioned that, Doncic was breaking my model too. Like that was before Doncic had hit some struggle shooting the past month or two. So it was really at the peak time for Doncic statistically, and he's come down a bit since then, but he still leads the EuroLeague in box plus minus. For the past 2 years, he's been a top 5 player statistically in Europe. And just comparing him to Rubio, the year Rubio got drafted, he had a 5 or so BPM plus 5 in Europe, basically in Europe. And just comparing him to Rubio, the year Rubio got drafted, he had a 5 or so BPM plus 5 in Europe, whereas Doncic this year is at plus 7.4. So he's still, even compared to what at the time was touted as one of the best young European players to come out, he's still crushing him. And I think that's where he really differentiates himself. He's not just good for his age in Europe. He's probably the best player in Europe as a 19-year-old. And that's just something that we've never really seen before in any, like when Kristaps Porzingis came over, he was barely getting minutes in Europe. Doncic is the guy on a team in Europe that's in EuroLeague, Europe, competing their butts off every week. And so I think it's just something we've never really seen before, which is something that makes Doncic so.
So let's move on to Marvin Bagley. His position has kind of been a big point of concern to me in the past. Is he a 4? Is he a 5? Did he show enough of a perimeter game to play the 4 most of the time, or would spacing be inadequate in most situations with him at the 4? And could him playing the 5 be more than a small ball lineup that we only see on the floor in certain situations? Feel free to attack any of those. We'll start with you, Advanced Stats.
My biggest worry with Bagley is just his defense. I think offensively he'll fit perfectly fine at the 4. He'll fit at the 5. I think he'll be a decent shooter, maybe not a great shooter, but he even showed a little bit of ability off the dribble as a shooter this year. And I think the free throw percentage maybe is a little bit of a red flag or yellow flag there, but I think he's going to be a good shooter. And then you look at him with other guy that can just dive so often and finish at the rim. He's got a great second jump that'll help him become a good offensive rebounder. And I just have a hard time seeing how his offense isn't going to be really good. And I was low on him before, but I think my opinion has changed pretty drastically.
Yeah, it's good to be open to changing your opinion whenever you see new information and you process it. And I agree with you on him being more fluid than Ayton. Ayton's more like the power dominance, but Bagley's just got like that fluidity. He runs like a deer in transition. What do you think about him, Jacob?
He's a really interesting prospect to me. He seems almost like a player kind of out of his time. He reminds me more of a kind of traditional 90s power forward in the way that he's not big enough to play center, at least full-time at this.
What do you think about him, Jacob?
He's a really interesting prospect to me. He seems almost like a player kind of out of his time. He reminds me more of a kind of traditional 90s power forward in the way that he's not big enough to play center, at least full-time at this point. But his game is still more based on running to the rim than it is straight up just space on the floor. And then I also echo the sentiments that his defense has some holes in it. I don't think it's as bad as Ayton, especially considering that he doesn't have the physical tools of Ayton, but there's quite a bit he has to figure out on that end to really be playable for any extended minutes at prime times in his career. I don't think at this point he can play center. I think he has to eventually play center because I don't see him long term.
Well, I started the season really low on Bagley, but he's consistently climbed up my board, and the fact that he's only at 7 tells you how low he was before. But I think I view him as a power forward strictly. I don't think he's going to play center more than a handful of minutes a game. And I would even lean he's more on the small forward side of the power forward position than the center position. He just doesn't have the length to anchor a defense. He's able to move in space pretty. He doesn't have the greatest defensive instincts, but he's really young. He might be able to develop that, and he has a great motor at the very least, so he works hard whenever he's on the court. It is true that his game would have been suited to like the 90s power forward role, and it's sort of out of vogue right now, but he might be coming in at just the right time, actually. That his game would have been suited to like the 90s power forward role, and it's sort of out of vogue right now, but he might be coming in at just the right time, actually, because the stretch 5, it was like almost this mythical thing a few years ago, but now it's becoming something that maybe 7, 8 teams in the league have a 5 that can stretch the floor and play big minutes. If he gets matched up with a center like that, I think he could be a fantastic player. But I think that fit is going to be important to how effective he is long term.
That makes sense. And I think the defensive concerns with him are there, but I don't view them as seriously as I do Ayton's, just for the fact that, I mean, the minimum baseline to be playing the 4 isn't as high as is the 5. I mean, in most situations, I guess if you can insulate the center's defense enough with just outstanding perimeter defense and an outstanding scheme, it could work. A player insulate the center's defense enough with just outstanding perimeter defense and an outstanding scheme, it could work. But those are my concerns with both Bagley and Ayton. Let's move on to a player I really enjoyed watching this season, Trae Young. He didn't have the season I think we expected when we saw what he was doing in December, with how he was just lighting up every defense he was playing, and then he kind of slipped as we got into late January, February. But I think his season was still very impressive. Eustacchio, how should we view his end-of-season shooting slump when trying to project him in the NBA?
It doesn't worry me that much. I mean, even though he wasn't shooting well as at the end of the season, I think that he wasn't actually playing as badly as some of the buzz around him made it seem like. He was still doing a lot of creation for his teammates, and overall, he primary initiator in that position in college. They're going to have some pretty low valleys. It's just the way it is. It's a hard job. But he also had some of the highest peaks we've ever seen from a point guard prospect. And trying to balance those two things in our evaluation. I think I would lean more towards the highs that we saw than worrying about the few bad games he had after he was exhausted from carrying the team all year.
Yeah, he definitely was carrying the team. I've never really got the fascination with people insisting on the best games coming at the end of the season. I think, they're close enough to the same player at the beginning and the end of the season for the most part. Some players do grow a lot during the season, but they're close enough that if they put up a great performance at the beginning of the season against quality competition, it shouldn't be viewed with an asterisk just because it happened in December rather than do grow a lot during the season. But they're close enough that if they put up a great performance at the beginning of the season against quality competition, it shouldn't be viewed with an asterisk just because it happened in December rather than February or March. Jacob, what do you think about Young?
I am very mixed on Young. On some ways, I think he's going to be a very successful offensive player in the NBA. But his defense really does worry me. I think he's going to be pretty horrendous on that end. And I know there's ways to scheme around that for teams. And there's plenty of easy ways to hide someone who's a bad defender. But I think if he ends up in the wrong situation, it could become a real problem that throws off his career. So I'm mixed on him. I probably would stay away from him if I was the team drafting in the top 8 or so this year, just because I don't want to be the guy up if his shot doesn't translate, which I think it will, but if it ends up not working out, then you just have a really bad defender who can't really do much else.
That's fair skepticism. I think in the 15th percentile or whatever offensively where a shot doesn't pan out, he probably still has the playmaking though. I think his playmaking is maybe underrated by some. I think some people properly rate it, so I'm not going to say it's entirely underrated. But he definitely has value even in the games where his shot isn't falling because, obviously shooting is very volatile. And unless you're Steph Curry or someone of that tier, I don't think he's that tier. I'd consider him more in the Harden tier of shooting. And that's still a crazy impressive tier that is almost unguardable. So, I don't say he's not Steph as a slight against him, but that's kind of how I view him. It's more the shot creation than the actual just incredible efficiency on said.
Underrated. I think especially in space, his playmaking is really good. I'm a bit worried about how he handles pressure, and sometimes that causes him to make poor decisions. But he's a really good decision maker in space, and he's a really good outlet passer, which is kind of underrated, I think. He can make smart decisions. The thing that worries me, like Jacob pointed out, is his defense could be bottom 5 percentile bad. It's not just like Bagley where we think he may be average or a bad defender. He could be outlier bad defensively. He doesn't have the physical tools. He often just seems disinterested on the floor, and guys just drive by him at will. That's my worry. As a shooter, it's really hard. My simple rule of thumb. That's my worry. As a shooter, it's really hard. My simple rule of thumb is all data matters, especially when you're looking at like a 30, 40 game sample. But I do agree that that fatigue probably played a significant role in his shooting that got worse as the season went on. I still believe in him as a really good shooter.
Yeah, I think I see the defensive concerns. What percentile do you think it would take defensively for him to not be Isaiah Thomas bad, Jacob?
I think he needs to get to maybe like Damian Lillard bad on defense. If he can get to sort of Damian Lillard with a little more shot creation, I think that's the sort of peak outcome I have in mind when I think of him. So I think it would take – I don't think he's ever going to be a good defender.
That is for him.
It would take – I don't think he's ever going to be a good defender. He's just – that's not what his game is. But I do think he has to get towards not average for a point guard, but 30th, 40th percentile. Like, not the worst, but not going to completely ruin all your defensive schemes either.
What percentile outcome would you say that is for him, though? Like, would you say that's his 80th percentile outcome on defense?
Oh, on defense, yeah, that's probably 75th or so percentile. It's certainly within the realm of possibility that when he has a lower offensive responsibility next year in the NBA, he's able to give more effort on defense. And this was all just some smoke screen because he was so tired from trying so hard offensively. But it definitely would have to be his 75th or so percentile on that end. And his offense should be good enough that even if he doesn't reach his full potential defensively, he'll still defensive end is going to be attacked. And if he doesn't get towards that 75th percentile, then whatever team he's on will have to really base the scheme around being able to help off whenever his man blows by him to really limit the damage it does.
Yeah, the playoffs are really a different animal in terms of scheming. Weak links and switching schemes are a death knell. So I think a switching scheme for him is obviously out of the question because there's no way that he can guard post players like Chris Paul, for instance. Chris Paul's not big, obviously, but he's very savvy at defending those post players, and that's obviously not going to happen. So I think probably 75th, 80th percentile, maybe at a Damian Lillard outcome. That sounds about right to me. All right, so to wrap up, there's plenty of other quality prospects we could dig into, obviously, but we're going to save those for a later podcast. We have plenty of time before the draft. Let's each throw in one name into the to wrap up, there's plenty of other quality prospects we could dig into, obviously, but we're going to save those for a later podcast. We have plenty of time before the draft. Let's each throw in one name into the ring that we just are really high on. If you don't want to throw a name, no worries, but I'll give everybody the option. I'll start, and I'm going to go ahead and throw Admiral Scofield's name into the ring. I think he's really undervalued in terms of his defensive versatility. Guarding 2 to 4, I think, is possible for him depending on the matchups. There's definitely concerns in terms of how he can get through screens at his current build. He just has such broad shoulders that getting through screens is just almost a task for him. But isolation defense, he did well. Post defense, he does well. And he's really just like a vocal leader in the heart of the team. Eustacchio, I'll throw Admiral Scofield to you next.
Yeah, I think he has a good chance of becoming a small five like PJ Tucker, as you mentioned. And but he's a reliable shooter. He's a smart player and more athletic than he's given credit for. He guarded several draft prospects throughout the year. Tennessee had a great defense overall. So I think he could be a sneaky good prospect for, if a contender was able to add him to the roster and use him within his proper role. I could see him becoming, having a fairly successful career.
And Jacob, what do you think about Schofield? Well, I've never seen him play, but I did throw him into my draft model when you mentioned we were going to bring him up. And everything that you guys have been saying is pretty much what the model is seeing. It sees his peak being a versatile, really solid defender who probably isn't going to add much on the offensive end, which, especially hearing with what you guys have said, which is so, and really help a contending team off the bench without really taking up too much cap space.
And Advanced Stats, do you have anything you want to add about Schofield?
I like him too. I think he fits into that role of just useful wings are so valuable in the NBA. They aren't that easy to find, and you can see him becoming like an average NBA player, which is totally valuable. Just a solid defender and a shooter. And yeah, I think he's a solid prospect. I like him too.
All right, Eustacchio, I'm going to throw it to you next. Do you see any prospects you want to really highlight right now?
Well, as you well know, my favorite player in this draft is Jalen Brunson. He's just so fun to watch and so creative as a point guard for Villanova. He helped them to win 2 national championships, and I think they
highlight right now.
Well, as you well know, my favorite player in this draft is Jalen Brunson. He's just so fun to watch and so creative as a point guard for Villanova. He helped them to win 2 national championships, and I think they only lost like 13 games his entire 3-year career there. Just an incredible record of winning. And if you look at his efficiency numbers, they're off the charts from everywhere and every angle you look at it from. He shot 70% at the rim this year, with only 22% of those being assisted, and shot 52% from mid-range, 3% assisted there, 41% beyond the arc, and 65% assisted there. So, like, every zone, he's just incredibly efficient. He's great at every major play type, in the pick and roll, isolation, and he's actually an incredible post player if you get a chance to watch him. Sometimes I just can't see a player this skilled failing in the NBA. And honestly, I think he's going to be a long-term starter. I moved him up to number 10 on my board today. So I don't think he's been given enough credit for the upside he has, because the skills he has are so far beyond any other college player in this draft. I mean, it's just off the charts. I'm probably overrating him, but Jalen Brunson is my guy in this draft.
Yeah, you've got me on the Brunson hype train. Actually, I had him second round, I think, in January, and you kind of pointed out the strengths of him and made a really good case for him. My comp for him is actually Andre Miller with a jump shot. Sounds like a very good player to me, and I kind of have high hopes for Brunson. What do you think about Brunson advanced stats?
Yeah, I too like him. I have him, I think, somewhere in the 20s.
What do you think about Brunson advanced stats?
Yeah, I too like him. I have him, I think, somewhere in the 20s. The athleticism does kind of worry me, especially at the point guard position, just because he does at times struggle to get by his man, I think, off the dribble. And he's going to be very reliant on his offense creating his value. And so his jumper is going to be really good, but I question whether the other parts of his game is really going to translate. And if it does, if his finishing is really good, he's definitely going to be starter good. But I have some questions about how that's going to exactly translate against NBA level length.
Probably fair questions. Jacob, what do you think about Brunson?
I think, I'm definitely not as high on him as you guys are. I view him more as the early second type pick. I'm definitely not as high on him as you guys are. I view him more as the early second type pick. A slightly older guy who can come in and be a really good backup point guard, or maybe a spot starter or a starter on a bad team one day. I don't think he has crazy upside. I think it's likely he kind of grades out as an average NBA player one day at his best. But I do like him. I think he's definitely the kind of player that a contending team could take a shot on, and he could really help bolster a bench just by giving them steady point guard play against other bench units for his first few years.
Yeah, I think if he's going to find like a lot of success, backup point guard for a really good team is probably where it's going to be. If he's going to be a starter, I don't know how high I am on the outcome of that team, but I don't think injuries happen without missing too much of a beat, because he's a really smart player who can probably adapt to a lot of different systems. All right, so I think we had an excellent podcast today. I definitely want to have all y'all back on. I'm going to go ahead and let y'all do your own Twitter handles so you can get the extra follows. Obviously, this podcast is heavily listened to, so you're going to profit greatly from the following. Eustacchio, let's go ahead and start with you.
My Twitter handle is at EVR1022.
And Jacob?
My Twitter handle is at Jacob E. Goldstein.
And Advanced Stats.
My Twitter handle is Advancedstats23.
Awesome. All right. I hope all of the listeners will like, subscribe, share, do all of that good stuff. Thank you, and everyone have an excellent night.